In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you why flails are the best weapon in Elden Ring. This is the 17th video in a series of videos that we've done where we go through all the weapons in a given weapon category, showcase their strengths and weaknesses, and give you tips about how to use them if you want to use them in their build. It has been an extremely long time since I've done one of these videos, back before Baldur's Gate 3, back before Diablo 4. We're talking like 6 months or so since I've done one of these videos. This is backed by popular demand, and I decided to start with flails first, predominantly just to get back into the swing of things. It has a low weapon count. This is a very difficult weapon group to use, admittedly, but there are some advantages to using some of these flails. However, before we get into each of the 5 flails, let's talk about the pros and cons of flails and playstyles I think most players will use when using them. So first up is the pros. This weapon type has high poise damage. If you're going for stance breaks, flails is not a bad weapon type. It has decent attack speed, although its chain is not as fast as something maybe like straight swords. It's still rather quick. It has good block counter range and good block counter poise damage. So if you're looking for a good block counter weapon, flails are definitely, should be on your list. And all non-unique flails have native bleed buildup on hit, which is fantastic. This is not something that's going to come in real handy out on the landscape where you kill enemies typically in a few hits anyway before bleed will trigger. But when you're in boss fights, this can come in really handy if it triggers once or twice. The cons of this weapon group are that their charged R2 has a very long windup, making it very difficult to use. So even though the weapon has very high poise damage, it's hard to use charged R2 attacks. There are not a ton of flails to choose from, and their movesets are all exactly the same. So there is not a lot of wide variety in terms of what you're getting from flails. Additionally, their dual wield moveset is kind of staggered, meaning their attacks are not synced up. So dual wield moveset is not so great with this weapon type. The Ash of War on the non-unique spinning chain is not very good. It's very difficult to use, and flails themselves only have a small selection of Ashes of War they can use compared to some other weapon groups. So there are quite a few cons to this weapon type. And when you're talking about playstyles that I think most people will use when using a flail, I think most people will use it with a shield. That's simply because of the poise damage that the weapon does on block counters, and the reach is fairly good. Additionally, the dual wield moveset is kind of bad, and there's only probably a couple weapons you would probably use some sort of like magic type build with them out of all of them. So I think typically you're going to see this with a shield. Okay, those things being said, let's start with the unique flails first. First up is the Family Heads. Family Head shares the default attack of other flails and deals physical and magic damage. It's tied for the second lightest flail in Elden Ring, weighing 5.5, and requires some points in strength, dexterity, and intelligence in order to use. The Family Heads is one of 2 unique flails in Elden Ring and can be found in the Sage's Cave and Altus Plateau, so it's not exactly easy to get early on, but it's not tough either. It has a decent attack rating at 661, with about 66% of that being physical damage. Unless you invest heavily into intelligence, then you'll get closer to a 50-50 split between physical and magic. Its weapon skill, Familiar Rancor, does 100% magic damage. That doesn't increase with dexterity, though intelligence does boost the damage of it by about 8 damage at max upgrade per point of intelligence. This makes things a bit tricky since you have to either prioritize normal attack damage with dexterity or Familiar Rancor damage with intelligence, or some combination. Ritual Sword Talisman, Shard of Alexander, Magic Scorpion Charm all increase the damage of this weapon skill, and thus should be considered when using Family Heads. The sweet spot for this weapon is about 55 dexterity and minimum requirements in strength and intelligence, and I highly recommend this stat spread, if not a bit more in strength, in order to use some decent medium shields. The damage difference between high int and min int with Familiar Rancor is not terrible, being only about 400 damage when fully buffed at end game. You could theoretically use this weapon with high intelligence instead of dexterity in order to be able to cast sorceries effectively, but you would lose out on a lot of melee damage in order to do so. For this reason, I think it's best to lean into the unique nature of this weapon and weapon skill and prioritize dexterity, since there are better weapons to pair with high intelligence builds like the Bastard Stars. Remember to use Carrion's Filigreed Crest with this weapon to reduce Familiar Rancor's cost from 25 to 19 FP. Assassin's Cerulean Dagger can also help offset FP costs if you use a shield and block counter often. Up next is the Bastard Stars. The Bastard Stars shares the default attack of other flails and deals physical and magic damage. It's tied for the second lightest flail in Elden Ring, weighing 5.5, and requires some points in strength and a lot in dexterity and intelligence in order to use. The Bastard Stars is one of 2 unique flails in Elden Ring and can be found after defeating Astal, Natural Born of the Void boss, which is pretty far into the game. It has very good attack rating at 657, with about 66% of that being magic damage, which is kind of the opposite of Family Heads. Nebula, its weapon skill, does almost exclusively magic damage, just like Familial Rancor, except for the melee portion of the attack where you actually connect with the weapon itself. This does a mix of physical magic damage with most of the steel dealing magic. This means that dexterity will increase the melee portion but not the rest, while intelligence will increase both. Nebula is also an exceptionally high dealing damage weapon skill and hits like a truck, so if you're looking for a very high damage weapon skill, Bastard Stars might be a good choice. The sweet spot for this weapon is about 50 intelligence and minimum requirements in strength and dexterity, though it still scales relatively well up to 80 intelligence and outperforms increasing dexterity most of the way, making it ideal for intelligence-focused builds and also good for NG+, where you can increase dexterity to get more damage out of it. This makes it a much better weapon if you plan to cast sorceries when using it compared to the Family Heads. Remember to use Carrion's Filigreed Crest with this weapon to reduce Nebula's cost from 25 to 15, and Magic Scorpion Charm to boost its normal attacks as well as Nebula damage. Assassin Cerulean Dagger can also help offset FP costs if you use a shield and block counter often. Up next, we come to the non-unique flails, with the first being the Flail. The Flail shares the default attack of other flails and deals physical damage. It's the lightest flail in Elden Ring, weighing 5, and requires some points in strength and dexterity in order to use. The Flail has the lowest damage of all flails in Elden Ring, but it can be acquired extremely early on in the Gatefront runes, allowing you a flail option almost immediately after beginning the game. Additionally, its damage is not so much lower than other flails that it can't be competitive later on. It is the second longest flail, though flails are nearly all the same length, and much like other non-unique flails, it has native bleed buildup, which can be deadly in boss fights. Its weapon skill, Spinning Chain, is not easy to use and has an extremely long windup when using its follow-up attack that makes it damn near impossible to land. I highly recommend that if you're using this weapon, you swap its weapon skill out early on for something else like maybe Wild Strikes or Flaming Strike. Infusion-wise, Sacred and Flame Arts come in first, with Magic just behind and Lightning and Fire coming in at third. Keen outperforms Heavy here, but not by a whole lot, so you could go either if you want. Cold is also another good option if you want a second status effect, and will trigger more often than Hemorrhage, since you'll have more buildup. If you really like the Flail, I'd recommend waiting a bit longer to use the Nightrider Flail, since it does more damage, looks a hell of a lot cooler, and can be found shortly after this one. However, if you insist on using it, I'd go Cold with a shield for block counters and Nice Burst against bosses. Next is the Nightrider Flail. The Nightrider Flail shares the default attack of other flails and deals physical damage. It's the second heaviest flail in Elden Ring, weighing 6, and requires some points in strength and a lot of dexterity to use. The Nightrider Flail is an upgraded version of the flail in nearly every way, though it is very slightly shorter and can be acquired by defeating the Knights Cavalry in Weeping Peninsula, which is not that much further than Gatefront Ruins. It does have much higher dexterity requirements at 24 though, which might make it tougher to use early on before you've had a chance to level up enough. Much like the Flail, Spinning Weapon is a terrible Ash of War since it's difficult to pull off, has short range, and the follow-up is extremely hard to land. So, like the Flail, I highly recommend that if you're using this weapon, you swap its weapon skill out for something else early on. Infusion-wise, Fire and Lightning comes in first, with Magic in second, and Sacred and Flame Art in a close third. The weapon scales much better with Dexterity or the Keen scaling than Strength, which is heavy scaling, but Cold is also a great option with only slightly less damage than Keen. Make sure you have enough strength to use a decent medium shield with this weapon for block counters, but don't put any more than necessary. And lastly, we come to the Chainlink Flail. The Chainlink Flail shares the default attack of other flails and deals physical damage. It's the heaviest flail in Elden Ring, weighing 8, and requires some points in strength and dexterity in order to use. The Chainlink Flail has the highest attack rating of all non-unique flails and basically has the same attack rating as unique flails, but it leans a bit more to the strength side than the Nightrider Flail. It's found from lesser Pumpkinhead enemies that roam the landscape, which are not too much further than the Nightrider Flail if you don't mind the look of it. Much like the Flail and Nightrider Flail, Spinning Weapon is a terrible Ash of War since it's difficult to pull off, has short range, and the follow-up is extremely hard to land. So again, if you are using this weapon, I recommend swapping out the Ash of War early on. Infusion-wise, Fire and Lightning come in first, with Magic in second, and Sacred and Flame Art just behind in third. Heavy outperforms Keen by a modest amount, and Cold is just behind Heavy if you wish to go that route. It's also worth noting that Poison is much more viable on this flail, as it has an attack rating of 536, compared to the 520 and 450 of the Nightrider and Flail when set to this infusion. Of all the flails, the Chainlink Flail makes the best use of a shield and flail setup due to its high attack rating and strength scaling, making it a solid choice to pair with a great shield for turtling and block counters. So that wraps up our video on Flails and why they're the best weapon in Elden Ring. They are seriously far from the best weapon that I've tested in this game. That is the name of our series, and I hope I showed you how you can get something out of your Flails if you are using one in the game. Stay tuned for more Elden Ring videos in this vein and also some other Elden Ring content as we gear up for 2024 and hopefully the release of the DLC. If there's a weapon type we have not done yet that you would like to see, let me know in the comments below.